My name is Everett Johnson. I am Carlos's brother. I'm from, at the moment, Jacksonville, Florida, where I live with my family. Carlos and I were very close when he was young, as a baby, because I was the oldest of the 4 children, and he came a little bit later, about 11 years after I was born. I wound up most of the time carrying him around on my right hip. I can remember that. And he would always just, it seemed as if he was fairly light. And I would go about doing my chores while he was on my right hip. And sometimes I would switch him to the left if I had to do something on the right side. But he was such a trusting baby. Whereas my sister, who was a little bit closer in age to him, would be a constant fidgeting. She was a handful. Carlos, on the other hand, was always calm. And that's something I remember more than anything else. He carried that trait, I think, throughout his life. There were 4 of us. I, as I said, am the oldest. And my brother Conley, who was 2 years, actually 3 years younger than me. Then a sister who was 9 years younger than I am. I am 67, I will be 68 in April. Carlos was 11 years younger than I am. And of course he was the baby. Not to say that he was spoiled. I would say that he had an easier go of it. And I didn't mind that at all. I thought he should have had. He had, in my view, I wanted to make sure he had more opportunities. That was my goal in life. My mother is still living. She will be 90 years old in September. My father unfortunately passed away when he was 49 years old in 1971. Carlos was a teenager at the time. I am the last of the children. That's a bitter pill. I never thought I would be, because the profession I chose early in life was that of a military officer, and in the Army, as an infantry officer, those are the ones who are out front most of the time. So I've had a couple of combat assignments, and I survived those. I thought I would pass before my brothers and sister, for that matter. But life has a way of ordering itself. Carlos was a very intelligent, well-read young man from very small on. He loved to read. At one point, when I was getting ready to go to Vietnam, I talked my parents into allowing him to live with my family at Fort Benning, Georgia, because in Jacksonville, Florida in those days, I don't know whether anybody realizes it or not, it was not. And that's the reason I left Jacksonville, was because there was no opportunity for young blacks of any gender, but young black men in particular. So I said I would take Carlos with us and expose him to a different environment. And that was the catalyst, in my view. He became driven because he had seen a new or a different lifestyle. And I think he wanted that for himself. And living in officers' quarters at Fort Benning in those days, in the 60s, was old Southern living for the most part. So he went to school. He was an honor student. He was on the honor roll so often that he was named to 2 years in succession as in the book, The Who's Who of High School Students across America. And it's a pretty thick book. I have copies at home. I'll always keep those, because there was my brother among the nation's elite of high school students. In his senior year, he was so well known within the city of Jacksonville that he was selected by Congressman Bennett at the time to be his page in Washington, D.C. And to serve as a page in Washington, D.C., although you're kind of a gopher, you get to meet and witness events as they occur in Congress. And again, that was fodder for Collis's young mind to dream for himself greater things. And when I returned from Vietnam, he let me know right away that he had dreams, things he wanted to do. He was going to go to college. So he went to Mercer University in Georgia. I can't remember, I can't remember exactly where it is. And he completed his undergraduate degree, master's degree, and in psychology of all things, and then was considering a doctorate in psychology. At some point, I don't know what caused the change. All of a sudden, as far as I know, it seemed sudden to me, he was working for the Sheraton Hotel chain as a food service manager for the restaurants and bars that were a part of that hotel in Jacksonville, Florida. And the Sheraton at that time was a pretty large chain. And he worked for them into the 80s. So after completing school and then going with them for that long a time. At some point, Sheraton decided to sell the hotel in Jacksonville. I can't remember the exact year, but that was kind of traumatic for Carlos because he had established himself there, he thought. He had dreams of owning his own hotel. So that was an interruption for him. And when we talked about it, Sheraton offered him an opportunity to come to Palm Springs. And he asked me, what did I think of that? I said, sometimes, Carlos, opportunities come in life from where you least expect them. So this has always been my philosophy. You have to go where your heart takes you. And if you enjoy your work, more the better. So he moved with Sheraton here to Palm Springs. I would like to think that was in the mid-80s. And the reason I can't remember all of these dates, too, there was a lot of things going on in my own life at the time. So there was intermittent involvement with Carlos during those years. And he came here, and I believe the Sheraton stayed open for a year, maybe two. And then they closed the one here in Palm Springs. And for whatever reason, he fell in love with Palm Springs and did not choose to go to another place where he probably would have had an opportunity to work in a larger chain hotel, I'd say in the Los Angeles, you name it, any place that was big, because his reputation was a good one. He could have gotten lots of recommendations. Because he used to call hotels and get me accommodations for my wife and I in places that he didn't even live, so I knew he had connections. That was, and the people treated us like royalty while we were in the hotel. So that was my brother. I was proud of him. He stayed here, and as I understand it, again, there is this interruption between he and I. We were not in touch as much. He was, I don't know how his life was here, but he was working for Wesley Thomas at that time. And I visited while he was working for Wesley at the restaurant they had downtown Palm Springs someplace. I'm not sure where it was. But I met Wesley and Carlos had not given up his dreams. Even though now he's down, from what I could tell, he was not at the level he was accustomed to. Carlos was always interested in fine things. He had clothing that he bought, watches, jewelry, while he was in his heyday, if you will, while he was doing well. But I could tell and sense when I came here that he was not doing as well. So I asked him at that time, was he considering moving someplace else where he had greater opportunities? And he said, no, he thought he could make it here. And again, the passage of time, and then he began to let me know that he was doing better. He and Wesley had gone into a catering business together. There was, I won't go into that part of it, but there were other things that were going on in his life at the time. But he was upbeat. He was in more communications with us, and that's the way he was too. If he was doing well, then he communicated. If he wasn't, then he kept it to himself pretty much. He did not want to trouble, as he thought, anyone else. those are the highlights of his life up until he separated from Wesley somewhat and opened his own catering business, CJ's, Epic Catering. I remember when he sent me cards and brochures from that, and he was headed off on a new path, if you will. He was going after his dream. He was in communications with Comfort Inns and Suites, the hotel chain, concerning, and he told me about it. He asked my advice, and I told him, Carlos, business, you have to treat it as business. Don't let your personality get into it. Be very, very analytical about how you approach this, because that is a big step. I know how those guys work. So that was into the 90s, almost into 2000, when that was no longer a theme in this conversation. So I assumed then that something had happened. And by this time I had moved back to the United States after living abroad for about 20 years. So I was concerned for him, and I called him several times, and he returned my calls because he was always busy, too busy to call, too busy to take a call. And finally he broke back through it. He said, okay, I'm having some difficulties. He had some property in Florida that he asked me to look after. And that's when I realized the extent of his problems at that time. He never married. He did not have any children, except for, as I've met some of his young friends here who call him Papa. You know, some of his employees, and some who moved on to other things. I met a young man last night who had quite a bit of money in real estate that Carlos met when he was 19 years old here. And that young man says that Carlos taught him about life. And he misses him, as will 3 or 4 others that I've met since I've been here. And again, being in his city, in his house, meeting his friends, has told me more about my brother than I knew since he and I were closer. When I think of Carlos, the individual, the young man, the teenager, the young adult, into his later years, he and my younger brother, Conley, were very religious. Hold a minute. Both Conley and Carlos thought of themselves as instruments of God. As I do as well. Do no harm. That was what Conley as a doctor, of course, that was their philosophy. And Carlos believed that the true quality of a man is that he empathizes with all people, no matter their station or their disposition. He would take a blow, no matter how strong, and come back stronger. He wouldn't turn his back on you, no matter what. For some, that is a weakness. For him, it was a strength. I think that's why he did not leave Palm Springs to go on to greater things as he could have. He had connections here that he did not want to leave. He saw some mission here that he had to achieve. He knew the Bible verse by verse, as did my younger brother. I'm not as well read, but I understand it. In my profession, the Bible was good to know, but not necessarily something you wanted to draw on. But Carlos lived his life that way. He was thoughtful, sometimes to the point of people sometimes thinking he wasn't paying attention, but he was. He was a good listener. Again, you did not think he was listening to you, but he would come back sometimes with something you said that even you might not have remembered, and then ask you about it. He was not vain, although he liked to be well-dressed, neat. He's fastidious to the point of sometimes being annoying, because he insisted on things being done in a certain way. Being the older brother, I could laugh at him sometimes and just play it off, because this kid is telling me what to do. Hold on, let's back up. Let's start all over again, Carlos. That's not the way it's going to happen today. Okay, but he'd back off and he said, okay. He was not envious to the point of having to have what others had. That was not him. He was brave, in my view, because he put himself in his quest for his goals, whatever they were, in positions where I thought it is putting himself out there and for the benefit of others. He would do favors for people that I would cringe sometimes to think what the outcome could be. He loved his mother. She missed him, constantly talked of him, constantly reached out to him, and he wrote to her in such a loving way that she would be pacified for the time, despite the fact that he did not come back to Jacksonville. If he did come back, he only stayed a very brief period of time. A lot of the family didn't understand why he was in such a hurry to come back to Palm Springs. So I can say this: since I've come back and spent these days here in his house, become acquainted with his things and the people he's met, I understand what he found here. This was his home. This community was his. He felt a part of it more than he felt a part of anything else in his life. I saw him this week. He looked so peaceful. He doesn't have to work anymore. And he's at rest. Finally, he gets to rest with God.